Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, it's important to also focus on the details. Mm-hmm. This season's theme is Zoom In. Once we know our big picture vision or strategy, we have to roll up our sleeves to get the work done. With each episode this season, we'll have our typical stories and make sure we talk about specific actions to focus on for 2022. But before we get started, we welcome back for today's episode our regular and partner, Jay Reyero.
Thanks, guys. Again, always happy to be joining you.
Yes, and before we begin today's episode, we need to wish someone who's off camera and off mic, one of our engineers, happy birthday, Riley. She's off mic, she's smiling, and is red face. She does a ton of work to help with these episodes, and that's why they're so smooth. Thank you, Riley. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, and Brad, thank you for not singing.
Now, second, for you and Jay, I have some personal questions. And Jay, Michael, I don't want you to hold back. I need honest answers. Have either one of you ever been swimming?
Yes.
Brad, why are you concerned that I will hold back on this question?
All right. For the audience, I will note that Michael did not answer the question. He asked the question with a question. So I'm going to ask him another question. Michael, how long can you hold your breath?
I'm pretty confident, Brad, that I can hold my breath 1 second longer than you. And why do you want to know?
All right. Do you know the longest time a human has ever held their breath?
Well, no, but I do have my assistant Siri, and the longest time someone has held their breath was 24 minutes and a little over 37 seconds. Why do you ask?
All right. Sounds pretty good. So, Michael, have you ever been scuba diving?
No. I'm guessing you are looking for an end to brag about your scuba skills?
Yes, you would be correct. I am scuba certified, and I did have some awesome dives. One of my deepest ones was I got to dive off the coast of Florida, go down to a ship that was sunk, World War II ship, so pretty cool stuff. But when I was preparing for today's episode, I was thinking about all the different options this client had when they decided to build a surgery center. In this case, he just kind of jumped in and started swimming, and that was the fastest route for him to get going. But it limits how deep he can go and, of course, how long he can hold his breath. And if he had slowed down and been maybe scuba certified like me or gotten the scuba equipment, he could have gone deeper. But that would have required him, for at least this client, to have at least some future planning.
Brad, I'm very surprised to see with your Louisiana background, your ability to bring the analogy into play there. Well done.
I can read.
Okay. Well, Jay, I think with that, let's dive into today's show, no pun intended.
Sure. So our client today in this story is a board-certified plastic surgeon. So let's call him Dr. Nip Tuck for today. And in the last episode, Brad, you and Michael talked at length about ambulatory surgery centers, or ASCs.
Yeah, and these are the medical facilities used for day surgeries, and they're generally, in this one, the episode we talked about, these were all licensed facilities.
Right. So, plastic surgeons also routinely use operating rooms. And so it's commonly the case, Dr. Nip Tuck in our story, he wanted to have one that was easily accessible, and he also wanted to have one that he controlled. Now, he could have gone down the route that you and Michael talked about, joining or developing an ASC, but just like Dr. Spine. Mm-hmm. In our case, Dr. Nip Tuck decided that he was going to go a different route when he was expanding his practice. And he decided to go ahead and develop what's called an in-office surgical suite.
And I should have put the disclaimer in again this week as we did last week. One of the challenges with the theme of Zoom in and kind of rolling up our sleeves and getting into the details is it can get kind of boring and heavy. And so we will do our best to really simplify what is pretty complicated stuff. And so just, again, know that if you start kind of wading in waters that are dealing with these types of issues, if you can just take away that you need to hit the pause button, you've accomplished a lot. And, I think we should pause before we dive in a little more and just understand this whole idea of licensing, because we're going to be dealing with that. Mm-hmm. It's usually a state level issue, and understanding what is it that that gives someone authority to do so. So obviously, if you're providing a professional service, the government is going to want to protect the public from just anyone doing it. Well, one way that you have the quote license is if a regulating board gives a license to an individual. So a doctor has a license to practice medicine issued by the medical board. That gives a line of authority to do a lot of things, including opening a medical practice.
Yeah, in that case, Michael, just as you're going, that medical license of that physician is all he really needs permission to actually open his medical practice. There is no additional medical practice license.
Exactly. And when the authority is not granted by the medical license, the state sometimes will have specific licensing processes and authority for other types of services. And so this is how often a ASC or ambulatory surgery center is granted, and you'll see non-doctors own it. They're following some sort of state licensing authority.
Right.
And so, Brad, with that kind of context, I think you should explain kind of what is in-office surgical suite in comparison to an ASC.
Again, getting into the details, so stick with us, audience. The in-office surgical suite is exactly what it sounds like. It's a suite inside, generally speaking, an operating room. It's inside their medical office. It's used to perform these surgical invasive procedures involving some level of anesthesia, where it's either general or even deep sedation. And for all intents and purposes, the function, it acts just like a regular surgical room in an ambulatory surgery center or in a hospital operating room, which probably most people are familiar with. The biggest difference is the connection. This is in this same medical practice. It's not some separate building, but to the outside world, it's great because it creates this more seamless experience for the patients, where the scheduling's easier because the same practice. It's located the same place they walked in earlier for their other consults, the same staff. Everything feels the same to them. So to the outside world, it's a great way for them to connect to it.
Yeah, and for those not familiar, if you go get a treatment and you're paying for a surgery, you may write a check to the doctor for what the doctor does. You may write a check for the facility. It may be a hospital, it may be a surgery center, and you may write a check for anesthesia. And what Brad's saying here is the facility part and the doctor part are all under the same business entity, the medical practice. And if they go to an ASC, then the physician will still bill for the professional services, and the ASC will bill for the facility. And so this, one of the advantages to this is it is more seamless to the patient. So my question to you, Jay, is if it sounds like an ASC and functions like an ASC, how is Dr. Niptuck able to go this route? And wouldn't he still have to get an ASC license?
And that's a great question. So, as you and Brad talked about in the prior episode, ASC licensing is a state issue. Every state's going to be different. Well, in some states, when they're defining what an ASC is, they'll either within that definition or as part of another part of the rule, they'll create this exemption where they will allow for in-office surgical suites to be exempt from the licensing requirement. And so that was the case here. Dr. Niptuck was in a state that allowed him to set up and operate an in-office surgical suite and not have to get that ASC license because it was specifically exempt. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still rules and regulations that he had to follow, including having the room certified by what's known as the American Association for Accreditation of Ambulatory Surgery Facilities. It's known commonly in this industry as a Quad A certification.
And thank God, Quad A. And because if you had to say that every single time, the American Association of Accreditation of Ambulatory Surgery Facilities, that is awesome and best at what they do. I mean, that could be the longest title in the history world. Quad A certification, it makes a lot more sense. But Jay, so at what point were we involved in this point?
So we actually became involved well after the practice. The surgical suite had been operational. It was a beautiful, nicely built out facility. And Dr. Nip Tuck was a distinguished surgeon with a thriving practice to go along with this suite. I mean, everything was going well. The problem when we came involved was that COVID hit, and Dr. Nip Tuck started thinking about actually slowing down his practice and moving towards retirement. And so this meant, as you can imagine, that this beautiful facility wasn't being used anymore, or wasn't being used as often, and was just sitting there basically empty and unused for most of the day and most of the week.
This is a common issue with our surgeons. You know, if you kind of step back in the beginning, when they're working all the time, it's not a problem having a facility or a suite that's put to full use. But at some point, something changes, and they may find that there are gaps in the schedule. Sometimes it may just be a few hours here and there, but eventually it could be entire days where it's not being put to use.
Yeah, I agree, Michael. And as you can imagine, the cost of having these beautiful suites, you're having high-end customers come in, so you have to have high-end look and feel to it. And you need to make sure that your still scheduling is completely full. And when it isn't, the client, in this case, the doc, they know they're losing money because people aren't coming in.
And that's exactly when we were brought in. That's exactly how Dr. Nip Tuck started to feel. And so, what he was trying to, ask for help with is, what's the solution to kind of stop this financial bleeding? What can he do to put to use this empty facility?
Mm-hmm.
The most common solution, and it seems kind of obvious, is to offer outside physicians an ability to use the facility for a fee. And so I'm curious, is this something you guys explored?
Absolutely. I mean, like you said, that's the first thing, the easiest thing that anyone considers. And this was definitely the first thing that he considered, and kind of the genesis for why he approached and asked us to jump in, was because he wanted to figure out what that looked like. Because there were a couple of physicians from different physician groups in the surrounding areas that they had kind of started talking to and had some interest in using the facility. And so there was some mutual interest there. The problem was this wasn't an option.
Well, how so?
So going back to the state laws, while Dr. Nip Tuck's state laws allowed him to have this surgical suite without a license, the laws also, though, restricted the use of the suite to only physicians that were part of his practice. So going back to what you and Michael were talking about earlier, the difference between an ASC and an in-office surgical suite is that it's an extension of the medical practice, or it's a part of the medical practice. Part of that then, under the rules, state that, only those that are associated with the practice can use it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, we talked earlier about ASCs and how that's a different license, and that, obviously if they had that would potentially open the door for other owners. Why couldn't he, Dr. Nip Tuck, just have applied for an ASC license at that point?
Yeah, so they also, that was also a part of their thoughts, and so they had explored that option. But when he started looking into it, when he found that there was going to have to be some reconstruction, some retrofitting to the suite to get it up to code and meet the standards of a true ambulatory surgery center. And really, when you're developing an ASC, a lot of contractors and people in the industry will say that the best kind of way to go about that is to develop it in accordance with the rules for a Medicare certified ASC. And when they started looking into what all that entailed, it was going to be millions of dollars of an investment just to get it to a point to even be able to apply for a license.
All right. So, good option, Michael. But, Jay, if we're going to back this limitation under Dr. Nip Tuck's state's law, he could have done something different, like bringing on a physician to his practice. Therefore, they could use it. But given the fact that I think you said in the beginning of this episode that he was close to retirement, that might not have been an option.
You're absolutely right, Brad. And the arrangements with independent contractor physicians didn't really appeal to him because of the risk involved. He and his team, at the end of the day, they were just frustrated with what to do with this empty space. And, I remember at one point, after we went through all these options and they didn't work, or they weren't something that he was interested in. And he was just trying to figure out, how do we figure out the solution? I mean, they were simply asking and saying, well, just help us get rid of this thing.
And I'm going to pause there. Michael, you said make pause moments. For our audience, if you cannot tell, if you have something you believe of value and your main sales option is just get rid of it, the overall value of that asset may be severely impaired.
That makes sense. And I'll add to, Jay, you alluded a minute ago to the fact of bringing in doctors was going to create risk to the practice. And I just want to note that if you are a practice and you have this in-office suite, when someone is operating in your facility, they are part of your medical practice. And so it's not, the risk is real that whatever that doctor is doing with those patients, directly impacts the medical practice, or in this case would have impacted the medical practice of Dr. Nip Tuck. So with that, Jay, what was the solution?
Well, the writing was on the wall that the thing needed to be sold. But even that, at the end of the day, wasn't going to be easy, because at the time, the only interested physicians were with unrelated practices. And it was going to be difficult to convince them to purchase something that would be difficult for them to use together in different practices without having to go with the ASC license, which, again, was going to cost millions of dollars just to get to that point.
Well, this is a great cautionary tale of how decisions made early on can impact things into the future. Let's go into a commercial, and on the other side, talk about what Dr. Nip Tuck encountered with his in-office surgical suite and other considerations similar surgeons may face.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd, and series regular, Jay Reyero.
Jay, you just told us a story of some difficult issues a plastic surgeon, Dr. Nip Tuck, faced with his in-office surgical suite when things started to slow down for his practice. If we take a step back, when a surgeon's interested in developing an in-office surgical suite, where's the best place to start?
Well, I mean, the only real place to start is the state laws relating to ASCs. Going back to what you said earlier, an in-office surgical suite sounds like an ASC and functions like an ASC. So you first have to determine, do you have to go the license route, or is there some kind of exemption that allows for these in-office surgical suites? Some states may not care and will require an ASC license regardless. And other states are going to be a little bit more flexible and allow for the physician to forego that licensing, just like Dr. Nip Tuck.
And Brad, I know in California, as an example, it's actually referred to as an outpatient surgery setting. They're a facility owned and operated by a physician, must only be accredited through one of 4 agencies that are approved by the medical board. Of course, Quad A, which Jay referenced earlier, is one of those.
Yeah, right. And in New York, they have something similar. They call it office-based surgery. And these are specific office-based surgery laws in place requiring private practice to perform office-based surgery to be OBS accredited by a designated accredited agency, which again includes our famous Quad A certification.
And to kind of round out the examples, Oregon's a state where things can be a little bit more tricky. According to Oregon, an ASC is not an individual or group practice office of private physicians that do not contain a distinct area. So there's one key aspect that's used for outpatient surgical treatments on a regular organized basis. So that's kind of another piece. Or that only provide surgery routinely provided in a physician's office. And this is the key, using local anesthesia or conscious sedation. So you can kind of see how there is an exemption, but it's kind of a limited exemption. You have to kind of fall within it. And so again, going back to the complexity, you're going to have to follow the traps to make sure you're meeting all those different pieces to fall outside the license requirement. Yeah.
Well, we're here in Texas, so I'll just shout out the Texas law real quick. But, based on Texas law, we're looking at that it's a facility that primarily provides surgical services. That's what they call an ASC, to patients that do not require overnight hospitalization or extensive recovery, normally referred to as like the 23-hour rule. But this rule in Texas it exempts offices and clinics of license, going back to our medical license for physicians or dentists or podiatrists.
Yeah, and some states are good about providing the detailed information on what's needed for this issue, like California and New York. But other states are more difficult to navigate. And so, Jay, once someone gets through that, let's talk about the next trap they're likely to face.
Yeah, so you do all the hard work, you get through the dense legal requirements and figure out what to do from a legal perspective. You kind of have the outline to get up and running somewhat. But I think, we can set aside for this episode, the potentially lengthy process of building out and obtaining accreditation and navigating the operational requirements, which are all critically important and required. But these are typically handled by the experienced consultants industry that work a lot with ASCs and in-office surgical suites. So in reality, the trap comes later on, much later on sometimes, when the surgeon or the owner is looking to allow others to use the facility. It could be a couple of docs or types of docs approach them and are interested in using that facility. It could be going back to what Dr. Nip Tuck experienced, certain situations that have the facility not being used anymore and trying to figure out a way financially to keep it viable.
Yeah, and I agree, Jay. We've seen this many times over the years where for one reason or the other, client approaches us and they want to use their facility for other providers to come in. I know we referenced that in our story of last week. And this becomes, there could be a bigger issue because now you're trying to figure out, is this a joint venture or is this an integrated practice model? And it could be like where Dr. Nip and Tuck faces, this facility is not being used as much. So whatever the reason, there are obstacles that they will face.
What's the most common one you've seen?
Well, it will go back to the beginning. It's the general rule, how you can use an ASC or accredit a facility. It's just not assignable. It's again issued to that particular person or individual. And again, we talked about this last week. You just can't lend your license or your accreditation to some other party for them to use. This has lots of consequences when things do go wrong. So the owner of the ASC is jeopardizing their license. Or other liabilities. Michael, you referenced this. If you have an outside party using your medical practice, the liability could be on your medical practice too. So it's a catch-22, right? So you have this situation where if you own the medical practice and it's inside of your facility, the physician wants to have other people come in to help offset that cost, but they're not sure if they're willing to assume this additional liability to their medical practice.
Absolutely, Brad. And let's add to that a little further, going back to a situation like Dr. Nip Tuck's, where you're operating out within an exemption from licensing. You're also potentially jeopardizing that. So you're doing an end around of the ASC license process essentially. So for an example, New York is very clear that only those providers who are part of the practice can perform procedures in the accredited OBS office. They even specifically point in an FAQ example that unaffiliated providers can't get around this simply because they've entered into some kind of an arrangement, such as a lease or a sublease, to allow them to use the space in an accredited OBS setting, because they know that that's a frequent type of transaction that people try to do is say, well, I have the license, I'll just sublease it to you and have you step into my shoes. And in New York, for example, is one that has really pointed out that that's not permitted under their exemptions for the license requirement.
Yeah, so we see these in-office surgical suites and the kind of related arrangements that we've been talking about often in the elective medicine space because it's cash-based. But Jay, you and Brad, as Brad, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, have encountered this when insurance is involved.
Yeah, introducing insurance reimbursements creates a whole other set of complications. It's very difficult in this setting to really go into it to understand that most insurance payers when they're going through a claim, they're looking at the tax ID associated with the license or the accreditation, and so that's what they're looking for. And all of a sudden, other parties show up and they're using that same license or accreditation, and they're not the party with the license. And this brings up issues of submitting false claims from the commercial payers, or even overpayment demands. And so, Jay, what ended up happening with Dr. Nip and Tuck Surgical Suite?
Well, they finally found, kind of going back to the end of the story, that really the only logical thing was to sell. And so what they ended up doing is they identified the only logical purchaser for the entire practice, which was going to include the surgical suite. Mm-hmm. They found that actual surgical practice who could take over and kind of replace them in the equation. So it would be falling under all the same rules and exemptions. And in this case, basically the purchaser could similarly use the space under the same exemption. And that was really their only option. And they ended up identifying someone who was interested in going down that path.
Well, there's a lot to think about and consider when looking at going the in-office surgical suite route. Jay and Brad, what are the biggest takeaways you guys have for our audience?
Well, obviously, first part is going to be understanding the state laws and what options are available. But really beyond that, I think when surgeons are evaluating their options, they need to consider whether they want to potentially allow others to use the space. Obviously, at the beginning, they probably that won't cross their mind. But the answer to this is key because it can potentially foreclose certain options, or it could require them to go down a route that kind of requires a significant capital investment. But I think more importantly, it doesn't create surprise. So when they're running into that problem or they're coming to me to ask for possible solutions, they're not surprised when, I hate having those difficult conversations that say, well, yes, I know you've worked out a deal with so-and-so, but you can't do that because it'd be, against your accreditation or your licensing or whatever the case may be. And so at least having those conversations early and planting the seed in their mind will help them be more informed for when the time comes for the issue to arise in the future.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, having these in-office surgical suites is great. I mean, they serve a purpose with our plastic surgeons and cosmetic surgeons. These facilities truly don't have to be they are inside their office, so they're not even an extension of their office. They're in part of their actual office. This helps tremendously with brand awareness. Your medical suites is your office. We talked about the use of the same employees. From the patient's perspective, they're not going to some new location with new people that they've been dealing with. And so all of that is awesome. But as we noted in the story, there are limitations and to the use. And Jay, you just walked through a lot of those limitations. And so it is important, if you are thinking about doing something like this, to hit that pause button that you referenced in the beginning, Michael, which is to make sure what kind of payer mix you're going to have. What's your long-term strategic goal as far as the sale of this practice? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you're just get rid of it. I just don't even want this dang thing anymore. It's devaluing what I perceive. So, Michael, your closing thoughts.
Well, I totally agree that knowing at the beginning where you're trying to go will influence it. I think back to, Brad, your analogy that was so you set us up with the swimming, and if you're only going to go under and want to hold your breath for 1 second longer than Brad, then it's great. It's fast. You jump in and go. It's seamless. But if you're trying to swim down to a shipwreck, you probably need to get the scuba certification and put the scuba gear on. So knowing what you're going to be doing before you get started makes all the difference.
Hopefully I'll see you guys again next season, and until we meet again.
Well, Jay, thanks again for joining us, and that closes out this show. But looking forward to next week when we have our good buddy Larry Keller joining us to talk about retirement and disability. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.